Welcome once again to our CST every second week webinar, our lockdown webinars as we've been calling it. Please write your name or just say hi in the chat box, and write shortly where you're based and what focus your work is on, so that we can have some kind of idea of who's joining us and what's interesting and what kind of ideas you're working with. So it's wonderful to see already so many people. We're about 50 or more registered. So we'll give everyone just a kind of a chance to connect with us. I know there might be people also from far away, and be great to just give people a chance to log in. But until then, I think we're just gonna say that today, I'm based at the CST, the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, and today I'm actually based in the real place here in Stellenbosch. And first time that we're running this webinar from the office, and I'm the only one here in my office, and next door to me is our project manager Cornelia, and the two of us are here. And outside there's some kids playing in the park. So if you hear some other voices, there are humans around, which is great, and it's an interesting feeling and experience to be here and not in my living room at home. So I think we're going to start. It's 1:01, and I want to just say a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the CST webinar. Our theme today is Building Systems Practitioners One Conversation at a Time. And our presenter is Samual Njenga, who is based at the Systems Thinking Africa, or heading up the Systems Thinking Africa consultancy, and is an associate lecturer at various business schools in Africa. And I'm very excited to have you with us today, Samuel. Really, thank you so much for being with us and to share your work with us. And I'd like you to maybe just take a few minutes to introduce yourself. Where are you? What is Systems Thinking Africa? Where are you based? Where are you studying? What is your work? Just give us an idea of your credentials before we go on to the presentation.
Thank you very much, Rika, and good afternoon. Well, based on where I am, it's good afternoon. I'm sure based on some others, I've seen Martin and others around here, so for them it will be good morning and possibly something else like that. Excited to be here. Really grateful, Rika, for the opportunity. My name is Samual Njenga, and it just occurred to me, just as you asked me that question a few minutes ago, that it is 26 years to the date since I came to South Africa from Kenya. So it's 26 years to the date, and it had not occurred to me that it was on this date that I actually left my country of birth and became an adopted person within South Africa. And it's been an interesting journey. So I live in Johannesburg. I run Systems Thinking Africa. Our intention and our desire is to see us building a body of practitioners, building a body of people who use systems approaches in one way or the other. So raising awareness of especially people in organizational management, in society management, in government leadership, religious institutions. How do we can look at complex situations that we are facing and use some of the tools and approaches that we learn from systems thinking approaches to be able to engage with that. So that's what we do. I also teach within a number of business schools. And again, there it's also around the application of systems thinking approaches to various fields like change management, sustainability, some elements of project management, leadership, and so on. And then just recently as well, registered for a PhD at the University of the Free State, where I'm looking at the future of workplace learning and the relevance of short learning programs of business schools and the future of workplace learning, but using a systems thinking approach into it. And it's fascinating. I'm enjoying it. I guess I'm told by people who have gone that route that it hasn't got to the part of pain yet. So I think I'm still in the lovely part of enjoying what I'm doing. So grateful to be here, Rika.
Wonderful.
And I'm married, and Tembela is somewhere in the chat as well. I think she's in the she's in the group somewhere with 2 children. Wanjiro, who was just finished her undergraduate studies at the University of Pretoria, and Njenga, who is a student at Parktown Boys.
Wonderful, and welcome to your family as well. Wonderful.
Thank you.
What an amazing journey, Sammy, and it's so wonderful that we were introduced, or that you actually, yeah, I've heard about your work before, and I think I've sort of, you know, I've only sort of been engaged in introduced to you by other people, and I've had a look at your website, but we've never had a real chance to meet. And then you contacted me earlier this year, and it was so exciting to hear what you've been doing and how you've been doing it, and what your deep knowledge of this space is. I think our work really focuses on sort of, yeah, theory, and then trying to apply it in our kind of research and our sort of research projects. But you've been at the coal face, basically, you know, living it every day and doing that in a real way. And you've got all these many years of experience, which you are now sort of doing the opposite of, and putting that knowledge back into academia with your you know, with your PhD that you're aspiring to and that you've registered for now. And so it's amazing to be able to learn from you today. And when I saw your title that you sent us, Building Systems Practitioners One Conversation at a Time, I felt jealous about it, because it felt spacious, real, authentic. And it felt like the interesting and important work that needs to be done in this space. So we're looking forward to your presentation. And just a small household logistics for this webinar is that that Samuel will present, do a short presentation. And if you have any questions or comments that you want to make, please do that in the question and answer box right at the bottom of your screen. I see someone asked already, Ben Palmer, is your microphone off? I'll have a look just now, but it should be. Put your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll attend to that, and I'll facilitate questions to Sammy as they come up. But also, if you have other kind of ideas in the chat box, I'll try and keep my eye on that so that we have some kind of interaction during a discussion. Sammy, do you want to share your screen?
So yeah, so thank you, Rika, and to all who have joined in today. Yeah, what an amazing group of people, and already the conversations happening. Even as I look at the chats, the different chats that I have seen just prior to this, and even on LinkedIn and other sites as well. And really, this is what it's all about. So. So I introduced myself, and maybe what I'm going to do is just take you through what we're going to do in the short moments we have. I'll talk about my own journey into systems thinking, because that's where for me it starts, and that's where it connects. Then I will bring in the idea of linking with this idea of a complex context in which we are working in, looking at systems thinking as conversations, and then specifically honing in around systems thinking in practice, which is a heuristic that I have learned from my friend Martin Reynolds and Ray Ison and others who are here on the platform already. And then the reflections on some of my own reflections from the work I have been doing in teaching systems thinking. So that's the whole approach that I'm going to take. And my journey was an interesting one, because it started with me being disillusioned with what we were doing in leadership development. I kind of felt disillusioned with what I was doing. I was involved as a consultant in leadership development, and I kind of felt like I was tired of 1 + 1 = 2. It's so neat. John Maxwell says, Steve Covey says, and then you look at the person that you're talking to and the complexity of the situations they are facing, and you get the feeling that you're just not there. You're just not there. It came home to me one time when I was in Malawi, and I was picked up by a driver from the airport, and he asked me what I do. And I was talking to him, and I said, well, this is what I do. I try to explain. So he said to me, are you like Steve Covey? And it was the first time anybody had ever compared me with Steve Covey. So yeah, we were told, yeah, he said we were taken on a course by Steve Covey. And we all learned about Steve Covey and all the things that he teaches. And then he said something very interesting. Remember, this is a driver. He said, when I got back to work, I realized that Steve Covey doesn't work here. Now, I could have told him that because Steve Covey was dead. But the point was, I think that driver raised the question that I was battling with of Steve Covey doesn't work here. And I think it's that disillusionment with what we were doing in mainstream leadership that got me inquiring, could there be a different way of doing things? And at that time, a friend of mine who lives in Cape Town, Chris Pease, introduced me to a few other people, Arnold Smith and David Newby. And they were running workshops in the communities and churches using systems thinking approaches, mainly based on the work of Murray Bowen, Edwin Friedman, and so on around family systems theory. And I remember sitting in that group and thinking, wow, this is what I've been looking for. I've been looking for somebody to validate and maybe say that 1 + 1 is not always equal to 2. I was looking from that. And then, so after that, I then went on and registered for studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Leadership Center. I see Shamim here as well. And for me, that was just a real great moment of being immersed into methodologies around systems approaches and different ways of understanding it. But I also got to become aware of the different fights around methodologies and terminologies. And I would come home talking about epistemology and ontology and axiology and feeling that, wow, there's a whole lot of terminologies that I'm also gaining. Hard systems thinking, soft systems thinking, cybernetics. And when I came and tried to talk to the rest of my family and other people around it, I found they would not get as excited as I was because they were lost in the debates and the terminologies around it. But there's something that connected with me about systems thinking, and that's for me an important part of this journey. I think for me, it connected very deeply with my African heritage. Connected very deeply with my African heritage. And I'll say why, and I'll say why in a moment. The thing is this, I think for me, almost from that time of trying to wrestle with it, the idea of systems thinking and systems approaches as conversations was a big one. Systems thinking as conversations. We are conversing with different issues that we are facing and different understandings. I didn't have the language for it, but to me it was that. And so right at that point, then we started Systems Thinking Africa, and our byline is transformative conversations. And the picture that came to my mind then, which I will share here, is this picture. Growing up in a rural village in Kenya with no electricity, no TV, sitting around the fireplace and listening to my grandmother telling us stories. It was that captured my imagination. It was this idea of systems thinking as conversation, as a conversational process. So I asked myself, where do those transformative conversations happen? And for me, it took me right back to that fireplace of conversations where we sat around a fireplace. So based on that, we then established Systems Thinking Africa to kind of ignite, to encourage these conversations where we engaging with complex situations that we are talking about. And we came up with a few commitments. And one of them, as I've mentioned, is this idea of conversations. I was glad to see Ray Eisen later on, as I read, finding this whole idea of systems awareness being conversation. It's the movement between being systemic as well as systematic, the balcony and the dance floor kind of experience. So this idea of a conversation, Reynolds and others also talk about that. I think the other commitment we came up with, which was exciting for me, was to realize that systems thinking was about capturing complex situations with models, building models. Shamim here and others have taught me a lot around that. So taking complex territories and creating maps, as Reynolds talks about them. They are not the territory, but they are maps to help me navigate the territory, as it were. So the idea of models became also something that was fascinating. And as a result of that, the idea of play, fun, and art as an integral process of systems approach. This idea of modeling, playing around with ideas, and you'll see that when I share with you. It also resonated with my Africanness in the sense of storytelling, because storytelling is an art, it's a model. You're telling stories. My grandmother would take us to places where we have never been by storytelling, telling us about giants and what, and through taking our imagination to places we have never been. But by building storytelling, by using storytelling as a process of modeling, helping us to then be able to live out our lives in the so-called real world. So the idea of play, fun, and art became very critical for me. And then this quest for that interface between the user, the context, and the methodology. So instead of being hung up on methodologies, what Checkland talks about is this dynamic relationship between the user, the context, and the methodology. So I am facing a situation. As I engage with that situation is changing, but I'm also changing, and my methodologies which reside in my mind and so on are also changing. And there is a dynamic that is happening there. Other people have talked of it as the known, the known, the knower, and the knowing. What is known or knowable, who's the knower, me, and the process of knowing that is a dynamic that is carrying on at the same time. And then from the family systems theory, which I have also brought into this mixture, the whole idea of the fact that the sickness is resident not in an individual, but in a system. The system is sick. And so we'll work around how do we diagnose a system. Edwin Friedman used to say, I work through the patient, who's the person, the identified patient, as he would call it, in order to bring health to a system. So he said, I don't treat a patient, I treat a system. And it's that understanding that sickness resides in a system. And for me, then I was asking, well, if sickness resides in a system, where do I find health? And over the years, what I have found is that both sickness and health reside in a system. So I'm trying to say, how do I help this particular system, whatever it is, to approximate health and to work towards health? And so, Rika and my friends, the last commitment on that has been, for me, the power of the right question. The power of the right question. I think if I've learned something from systems thinking, it's not about answers, it's about questions. It's about journeying with a question. So a story I often tell is one time, those of you who might know a little bit about South Africa, the northern part, I live in Johannesburg, about 2 or 3 hours from here to the north is Limpopo. It's got lovely places for family, vacations and so on. And on one Friday, we were driving up. It was a Friday afternoon. It's a time when it gets a bit dark. And we were in an area that is known for car hijacking, so it was not very safe to stop there. And at that point, there was a smell in the car. And it's a kind of smell that I cannot ignore for very long. So after a while, I kind of say irritated, who has made the poo? Who has made the poo? And at that point, I'm thinking, well, it can't be me because I'm the one asking the question. Hopefully it's not my wife. And it can't be, we've got 2 children at the back, and one is, I think 6, and the other one was 2. And I said, who's made the poo? And the 2-year-old said, Njenga, him now. And I'm irritated, I come out, stop the car where we are not going to be hijacked. I open up his nappy, trying to change him, and I discover it was dry. We were going through a section that had a bad smell because of sewage treatments or something else like that. And as I drove from there irritated, it occurred to me, what was my mistake? I asked the wrong question. I asked, who has made the poo? So I asked myself, how could I have asked the question differently? What is smelling? And look at how many times we've said, who is the poo? We look at a country like Zimbabwe a few years ago and we say, who's the problem in Zimbabwe? Robert Mugabe. You take Robert Mugabe out, does that solve the problem? Not necessarily. Who's the problem in Iraq? Who's the problem wherever? And instead of saying, what is it? What is the problem? So the power of the right question. So at that point, then I get introduced to systems thinking in practice. And that for me was a very helpful heuristic, very helpful way of learning. Because the systems thinking in practice, what it does, it talks about, I'm facing a complex situation, whatever the complex situation is. It's, who defines a complex situation? It's me who defines. And by the way, complexity here, it's not just about the different elements interacting as in complexity science or theory. It's also about perspectives of the different stakeholders involved in this issue, the different stakeholders as well. So I'm facing a complex situation. And systems thinking in practice, which has been developed by Martin and others at the Open University, Ray Eisen and others as well there, talks about 3 kinds of conversations. And you can see why I really jumped to it when I loved it when they talked about it as conversation. The first conversation is, I'm looking at a complex situation and I'm asking myself, what I want to understand the interdependencies in my situation. So that's the first conversation. I'm conversing with the complex reality and I want to see how are things interrelated and interdependent. The second conversation is now saying, okay, so I am now understanding a little bit better the interdependence. Let me engage with the perspectives of the different stakeholders and stakeholding interests in it. So that's the second conversation. It's me now engaging with that situation and saying, who are the stakeholders? What are the stakeholding interests that are here? If I want to intervene and to improve this situation, who are the people involved in it? And the third conversation is a conversation that is me doing a boundary critique, if I may call it that way. I am critiquing my assumptions. I am questioning my own assumptions. I'm looking around to see, where am I missing something? So for example, blind spots. Where am I missing what are my blind spots? But I'm also looking to see what could be some unintended consequences of my actions. What could be some of the unintended consequences of my action? So when I got introduced to this by Martin and the others, I really loved the idea of systems thinking as conversations. So let me just show you how we have applied it and what then it means, and then I'll open up for some conversations, for some discussions, for questions as we go along. So let's look at the context. And the context, we know it. COVID, for example, what a mess. COVID has thrust us into a complete complex situation that we had never thought about a year ago. It was just slightly more than a year ago. And into that, we try to make the best of what we can. And I like what Kenneth Halstead says. Kenneth Halstead talks about that we find ourselves trying to get out of these dilemmas, messes, wicked problems, swamps that we find ourselves in. And as we try, the attempted solutions are well-intended. They are well-intended. But what tends to happen is they lead to more stuckness. So we find these unintended consequences many times where we are spinning the wheel and something tells us we need to spin the wheel. So we spin it faster, but the faster we spin that wheel, the more stuck we feel we are becoming. And what Kenneth talks about is that it's because these ideas of spinning the wheel are built into the rules and the structure of our decision-making processes, and they create life-draining feedback loops. This is not very strange because, or very foreign, sorry, let me just come back here. It's not very foreign because Sir Geoffrey Viker has also talked about it, talking about traps. And he looked at the lobster trap and said the same lobster goes in, but it can't come out. The hole has not changed. It's the same hole, but the lobster is unable to come out. And so this idea that we are trapped not so much by the external reality, but by our own thinking about it. It reminds me of the movie Chicken Run. And these chickens are in a farm, as you know, and if they can't produce eggs, they get turned into chicken pie. And, 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 and one of them comes with the idea of escaping. And as they try to escape, they get caught, they get punished. They try to escape, they get caught, they get punished. And eventually they sitting together and having a meeting and talking about their attempts to escape and how difficult it is. And one of them says, you see the problem. The problem is those fences. Those fences are our problem. And I like what the leader says. The leader says, the fences are not out there. The fences are in our minds. The fences are not out there. The fences are in our minds. And based on this thinking of stuckness and complexity, yes, in our complexity, the idea of traps, yeah, the idea of traps, different kinds of traps that we get caught into, you start to see a lot of those in the way we are trying to address the challenges that we are facing. And the more we are trying, the more stuck we are becoming in many cases. And because we are using mechanistic or linear approaches that have worked before, and that's the approach. So what Kenneth Halstead says, and not just Kenneth Halstead, but the whole body around family systems theory, is that they bring in this notion of organizational anxiety. The more we're feeling stuck, the more we're becoming anxious in terms of organization, whatever the organization is. And when we feel stuck, then we instinctively think to accelerate. And the more we accelerate, the more we're getting stuck. So that's just it's a quick run in terms of the context, which you and I know, you and I are facing in organizations, especially now in the time of COVID. We are feeling like that. We are trying to accelerate to get ourselves out of this mess. So how has systems thinking in practice, the heuristic, helped me? I mentioned that, and what have we done with it? The first conversation is understanding interdependencies. So when I work with my students or with whoever I'm working with, I want to work with them to try and understand what are the interdependencies and interrelationships to help them develop models that enable a better understanding of those interdependencies. And there are different ways we do this. One way is to do story walls. Story walls, we put a whole wall that is sticky and we get people to stick the story of their organization or their community. And by looking back at that story, they are able to see the interdependencies. Oh, this happened and then it led to this, and this happened and it led to that. Another one, and I wish I had one next to me here, is a Jenga. We play Jenga games, Jenga blocks. And I love playing Jenga blocks, especially before we had lockdown and COVID, where we had lots of restrictions. We played Jenga games a lot because as we play the Jenga block, it starts to become clear that as I move, I'm moving a piece, but I need to play the whole. I need to play the whole. Every piece I move has an impact on the whole, and we talk around that. Peter Checkland's rich pictures, another helpful thing of being able to capture these interdependencies and interrelationships. And we have fun playing around with pictures or collages or things like that that bring around rich pictures. One who could go on to causal loop diagrams and things like that, but it's different models of trying to understand interdependencies. Lately, I've become aware of the work that Otto Sharma and others are doing around the use of body language, body space, body art in terms of modeling and how the body itself represents even the stuckness that we feel in some of those situations. So the first part of our conversations is normally around working with whoever is in the room to say, how do we understand the interdependencies and the interrelationships that are in my situation? The second part of our conversation is often around this one of multiple perspectives. So Churchman talked about a systems approach begins when first you see the world through the eyes of another. How do I see the world through your eyes, but enable you to see the world through my eyes as well? And again, the story wall was a very helpful thing of enabling people at different generations in organizations and societies to say, oh, I didn't know that. Is that why? Then you start getting people saying, wow, I see something different. So a process of mirroring. We use rich pictures as well for that. And in one organization, I actually used clay. And it worked very well. What this particular organization, we gave everybody, we were doing a strategy process, and we brought everybody together and gave them modeling clay, like clay that you use for pots. And we said everybody, because the CEO was there, the driver was there, the specialists were there, and so on. And I said, can you model a picture of what this organization looks like to you? It was fascinating because that equaled the ground for the driver to be able to talk alongside the CEO, alongside the chief financial officer, and so on. And then the third bit, which I have already alluded to, is this conversing with the limitations of our boundaries. Every time we work with systems approaches, we are aware that we are limited. We only see a little part. And so how do I test my assumptions? And there are two things that are important here. One is blind spots. What am I not seeing? Because we all have blind spots. What am I not seeing? And secondly, what could be the unintended consequences of what I'm doing? What could be some of the unintended consequences? And it's here that the work of Werner Ulrich in terms of critical systems heuristics is also very helpful in helping participants to look at the situation and say, oh, okay, this is my situation. What do you see? But also with work of Werner Ulrich talking about the ought and is. So what is the situation? What ought it to be? Who's gaining power? Who's losing power in this? So we start asking those kind of questions. One of the way we've done this practically is to put gallery walls. So people tell their story and put them on the wall, and we all walk around and we talk to each other. And again, it is a way of helping people to critique their own assumptions, because it's difficult for us to see ourselves. So let me then conclude with this. Let me conclude my journey with this. I want to conclude where I began in some way by talking about, I want to conclude with what's been my insights coming from this particular, my reflections coming from teaching systems thinking and working with systems approaches. And I think the big one that I have already mentioned is this idea of journeying with questions. Journeying with questions. It's a big one. Let the question be your guide. And it's difficult because organizations are trained to find answers. We're trained to look for answers. And you come with this element of the question, we simply want to jump quickly into the question, into the answer. And how do I stay back, hold back, and stay with the question? And so I ask myself, even as I journey on this, a few questions. One of it that is bothering me: are we teaching systems thinking in unsystemic or mechanistic ways? And I'll tell you why I say that. In the business schools where I'm teaching, I'm normally given a day. So I'm not there the day before, I'm not there the day after. I'm plugged into a day, I come into that day, I do my bit, and I'm gone. And I don't know what the person, or I might look at the program to see what the other person taught. But I kind of just think to myself, are we teaching systems thinking in unsystemic ways, in mechanistic ways? And leading on to that, a question that I was asked by one student who said, are you not actually adding our frustration by taking us through this? Because we're going to go back into organizations, families, society that largely runs on mechanistic rules. You've opened my mind to see this. Are you not opening me up for failure? So I ask this question around, are our systems thinking processes, sessions, creating more stuckness? And I think Martin Reynolds and others have reflected on that in terms of our stuckness, even as systems thinking practitioners. But I look at my students and I'm looking at them sometimes at the end of the day, And I'm thinking, okay, they've had a day on systems approaches, but where are they going? They're going to an organization that really runs on linear, start, stop, start, stop. And we're creating that level of dissonance. And therefore, arising for that, asking myself the question, what then needs to be in the body? And maybe the body is not the right word, but what needs to be in that process of teaching of systems approaches? And increasingly becoming very excited about the idea of immersions, immersing people into real life experiences, into situations, and learning as they get immersed into that. But still asking myself that question, what needs to be in the body or in the approach that we are taking? And hence, leading from that, my own question around then in terms of the PhD process, what does learning look like in the workplace, or need to look like? What's the learning of the future needing to look like? Our business schools and management institutions and so on, are we really in touch with that? But even HR practitioners and training practitioners in the workplace, are they reflecting around what is learning in itself, and what then needs to happen in that particular space? So these are the questions I'm wrestling with. And then I've mentioned the question of immersion. And so I come back again to where I began. I think for me, it's around creating these fireplaces of conversations where we can sit and converse with one another. But it's also about saying, how do we make sure that those fireplaces of conversations, going back to Varna, Ulrike, and others, are places where we acknowledge these power contestations. And so how do we make sure that your conversation is, or your perspective is not privileged over other perspectives because, say, of your position or your gender or whatever else? So, yeah, so Lisa, tell us a story of a time when an African-centric approach to systems thinking opened new options to stuckness in African context. Wow. Lisa, I think for me, I may not necessarily name organizations, but I will tell you about a particular organization where they had been doing the strategy sessions for a while, and still getting the same kind of solutions, if I may call it that way. And so when we started talking with them, I literally brought firewood and big stones into that boardroom. And we put a pot there. We couldn't light the fire, obviously, in a boardroom, but we sat around it. And I said to them, I would like you to picture this as an African fireplace. And as what we know about an African fireplace, and people started to talk. What happens with an African fireplace? What kind of stories? How are those stories told? And we moved on from that gently into talking about the organizational story. What I will never forget is that sense of, at some point, one of them jumped up with an exclamation and says, this is it. We've been missing this. We've been missing the fact that we are real human beings who are working in a real context with real people who need to be telling their real stories. We've been stuck on this thing of strategy as a document, and we have missed the fluidity, the organic nature of it, and that storytelling. And now I don't know what has happened to that organization in terms of, because they went on then to develop a completely different kind of an approach. But it was a way of getting out of this stuckness of caught up into models of and frameworks. People like frameworks and they like documents of strategy, and moving out to say, what if we looked at strategy as a story of an organization, a story of our future, a story of a people who also have stories. Yeah, so I think that for me is one that I would tell.
Okay, Sammy, that's yeah, it's a very wonderful to hear your experience, your deep and rich experience of this, and seeing how you've traversed between the theories and the writers and the authors, the ideas that are in that form the jargon of systems thinking, which can often feel very alienating when you have to communicate that. But that you've actually found a way through your practice of to bring that home to people and for them to experience these ideas. And I think that's often the missing link in all of this, is that how do we give people an experience of how this way of thinking can allow us to be different in the world, make different kinds of worlds possible, and allow us to shape the world in a way that opens up, like you say, the organic nature of things, and not not assume that we're working with linear machines that can work with theories. Mm-hmm. I see you're looking at this at what's been typed in the question and answer box, and I'm really so amazing that you brought so many wonderful people of your network with us, and Martin Reynolds.
Yes. Yes, and Martin is asking, which of the three conversations is most challenging?
Which of the conversation is most challenging?
And I find it's easy. It's a lot easier to get people around a room and say, let's do some rich pictures about our situation. Let's talk about what are you facing in your situation, who's involved. We do that. I find it a lot difficult to get into the next part, which is around understanding the different perspectives in the room. And the reason for that, especially when there is huge contestations in a situation, huge emotional investments, people see, I am right. I am right. By the way, Rika, one of the things I didn't mention is, and this comes from the work of Derek Cabrera as well, is I have started asking myself questions about what if I wasn't spending all my time with 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds? What if I was spending my time with where Africa has the bulge, which is really around the 19 to the 35-year-olds? And so we turned this as a question to my daughter and her cousins. And I said, guys, I would like you to help me think, what does systems thinking mean for a 19 to a 35-year-old? And we've had to wrestle with that. And one of the things that I remember in one of the conversations with them was when they were talking about the challenge of parents and teens. And they were saying, but Daddy, we were using actual stories. So they were saying, in this case, she is right. She is right. The parent is wrong. Now, how do I get that parent? How do I get this person in my room to suspend that judgment and say, could I hear the perspective of the parent as well? So I find this engagement with the perspective being one of the most challenging ones.
Yeah, that's a whole different space that you're opening up, and challenging those boundaries also, and bringing in the voice of the youth and the experience of them. We're getting a number of questions on multiple channels here, and I think two of these questions I'll try and collide into one, and it's one of Ilse and one of Mark Swilling, saying that the complexity space, or we can even call it the system space, is very white. What is being asked of the complexity of systems community and ourselves to address this, and that's Ilse. And then Mark was asking, are there any other African writers whose work you've maybe drawn on or found useful to think about complexity, relationality, and how this systems thinking worldview relates to kind of the decolonial turn arising from that literature? Have you been challenged, or have you found anything in that space? And what to do with the whiteness of this space?
Yeah. And Mark, you're right. That's one of the things that bothers me even now is the whiteness of it. And the many times when I've even presented this and people say to me, don't bring ideas from the West here. and don't bring just importing ideas from the West. I'm saying, fine, maybe they could be said to be ideas from the West. But when I visited my grandmother did not, when the crops were not doing well, she did not say it's an agricultural problem. When the children were sick, my grandmother did not say it's a health problem. For her, it could be the neighbors who have looked with bad eyes at the children. So there's a spiritual dimension to it. In other words, for her, there was this element of interconnectedness. And I can go on and on that. Now, I haven't, apart from going to look at people who have written, purely around African culture and African tradition, I haven't found any that are talking around the interface of that together with the systems thinking or complexity ideas. And that's I guess for me is a hunger for how do we get this told, but how do we also, Rick and I have had this conversation before that in some way I almost wish a PhD, and Martin as well. Martin knows this story, that in some way I almost wish a PhD could be written by telling stories, because I could tell stories the whole day and get my PhD. But the challenge comes when you say, all right, put it on paper. Okay, now comes the other issue. So I think there is an opportunity there, or around how do we translate some of these even oral stories. But I also like the thinking around the fact that, and Martin talks around that quite a bit, Ray as well, who's a systems thinking practitioner? Is it the person who uses these terminologies, or is it even the person who does not know a thing about systems thinking as a methodology or as a concept and uses that? So what does that entail? Who is a practitioner? And that's definitely a question. So I think for me, it's a quest, it's a longing to hear more and more African voices. I was looking for textbooks to use for my class at the University of the Free State. And I can't find textbooks here. I can't find books here that I can be able to say are written from an African perspective. And I think that's a challenge for us, definitely.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that honest answer also, Sammy, because I think that is I think there's probably a lot more deep knowledge, deep experiential knowledge invested and, collectively present in African experience and African lives. And it's sort of, it's this way of being in the world that hasn't been, analyzed to the extent that we can call it certain things, but it's the way of coming to the world and how we grow up in communities or in different spaces that brings in maybe a more systemic or organic approach to the world. I think there's so many spaces where in organizations, in work, like you're doing your research on, and through different mindsets, through which we've become disconnected from our spiritual roots, from our natural roots, roots in community, and how we sort of bring together knowledge and experience in all of that and bring that full capacity of what it means to be human to certain spaces in how we do business or how we make decisions and how we approach things. So I think, it's time for us to tell those stories, and the stories I'm sure are much more important than the PhDs. But we live this double thing, the double feet in both worlds. And I think this is what you have done for your work and your academic creations and your practice draws on all of that. And I think that's extremely new and rich, deep for the systems thinking space. So even more important is the work that you're doing in this space. I see that there's a number of things happening in the chat box, but maybe just also to honor people who've posted some questions. And is asking this question about how do we start those conversations, these transformative conversations, if people who want to have them are not in a position of power or influence or leadership. And I think connected to that, how do you envision immersive learning experiences in contexts such as Anne's, where people have almost none, if any, experience in doing these things differently? So I think it's about agency and learning to act in those spaces where it seems maybe impossible. Do you have any experience having done that, or
yeah. And again, again, also very grateful for the different other resources that people are posting there. And I think that's very helpful as well, because part of the challenge, part of the problem, I think, in some of these disciplines like systems thinking, complexity, is that they tend to be boxed in. They were attempts to unbox people, if you think of it, or unbox our thinking, but they have ended up being boxed in themselves. And so I'm looking at literature within a particular box, and maybe it's not within that box. Maybe somebody who's written something on theology is actually coming into that space, or somebody on sustainability is coming into that, as Mark Swelling is talking about. And so really appreciate this. And I think to answer a question around agency, this is where I have found the work that has been done by people who are in the family systems theory very, very helpful, very helpful. And I remember one time presenting in a session somewhere, and one of the systems thinking purists said to me, they don't consider the whole area of family systems theory as really mainstream systems thinking. Now, that's a different fight altogether. But I think for me, what I learned from family systems theory and the work of Mary Bowen and Edwin Friedman is this idea that because we are interdependent and we are interconnected, if one part of a system shifts, it impacts on the stability on the entire system. And so that's why Mary Bowen and Edwin Friedman specifically would talk about, I work with the person who comes to me as a psychotherapist, but I'm not treating them, I'm treating the family as a system, because if that person makes a shift, that shifts the family system. And so I use that as a metaphor for myself, and a hopeful metaphor of agency, that yeah, it might be helpful to think of, I wish I had the organizational leaders. But even if you go to the organizational leaders, even if you go to the executive members, they will tell you they have a board. If you go to the board, they'll tell you we have a shareholder. So where will this end? So ultimately for me, I say, let me rather work with whoever is before me and work with them as what Edwin Friedman calls the identified patient, and therefore work with them in terms of how do we bring about agency that starts to shift their system given their scope of where they are. And if that shifts, it could shift others as well. And on the one question around, for example, working with government departments, which are very steeped in policy, in what have you, and so on. We did some work with government departments in one of the provinces around. And I cannot lie, it was very difficult. It was very difficult. You try to shift and people see it, but it's almost like that deer that comes, or that springbok that comes to drink water, sees its image and runs away. They come there and you're almost feeling like, yeah, we're getting somewhere now. And then you hear somebody says, but Sammy, oh, then we are back again. And it was this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But shifts started to happen. And they started to happen with more and more of those conversations and people influencing their immediate areas. It was also helpful for me to think about the approach that talks around, I look at where the system, the symptoms manifest, but where they manifest is not necessarily where they originate. So I also say to myself, what is the decision-making system that sits above the system of interest, and what is the system beneath which implements this. And so having that constant conversation has also helped to create shifts. But I cannot be naive and say it's an easy process. I think all of us would know that. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, there's that's wonderful too. I think that's sort of, yeah, this idea that small things can have large effects, or the systemic nature, the way in which things are interrelated. Just thinking about how small, yeah, often we feel that we have to throw huge loads of money to solve huge problems, but often it's sort of how can we distribute smaller things, or smaller, how can we have maybe a set of smaller conversations in an organization to bring about these, like you say, almost localized changes that might have systemic reach. I think, yeah, it's like putting yeast into a system when you bake. I'm not a good baker, but I think someone tried to explain it to me once like that, is that you just maybe need a small piece of yeast to put in, and we don't know what the outcomes would be or how it will affect the huge part. But that's kind of the organic workings of that. And you explained it beautifully with your example. We've got 2 or 3 more questions. I think just to honor also Bruce Snadden's question in the chat box earlier on, maybe just a quick answer. Have you looked at design processes and futures design? Have you used any kind of this sort of more formal design school work in your practice?
No, I haven't. But but recently it has come up where the question has been raised around what is the relationship between, because design thinking has suddenly become very popular around, yeah. And what is the relationship between design thinking and systems thinking? And therefore, on the basis of that, it is an area that I have been reading around. It's not something that I have done work on necessarily.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And then we have a last question that we'll take from Amanda. Sorry, I think I'm getting some competition here from the park. Samuel, thank you so much for your thought-provoking talk. Her question is, academics, aren't we also part of the problem, speaking about systems thinking in borrowed language, yet on the ground within our African context, the relationships, interdependencies, processes are very evident from our history. What can we do better? She says, Ubudlalwane Bukama. These are all the terms which have been used to describe relationships in Africa. How would you want to maybe reflect on that?
Amanda, thank you. Thank you. Yes, definitely. I jump in there with both feet in terms of saying, yes, the question of the language is a big one. And I started off by saying that even for me, I've been attending some of the, for example, the systems thinking conferences. And sometimes I would be sitting there and I'm thinking, I have no clue what they're talking about. I have absolutely no clue. The language is above me. But even then, even the idea of systems thinking. So with the young people we are working with, I think it was yesterday, we had a conversation with them, and I said, so what are you guys working on now? How are we going to get this to the young people? And I said to them, what do you understand by this thing of systems thinking? And so they started explaining to me, saying it's using systems approaches and methodologies to, they kind of picked it up from me. And I said, no, we can't do that. So what do you call it? And I think that's something we need to break away from, is to start to say, what is it if it's not systems thinking? Because systems thinking then takes us actually back into that pot of that struggle of fighting around language. So Amanda, I think for me, it's a journey. I'm on a quest to find what is it that we can be able to use, what kind of other symbols, other language that we can use that can explain better and maybe be more real than trying to talk around systems thinking, which immediately people start thinking about cogs and machines and systems like that.
Great. There's so much that we could have more conversation about, Sammy. Thank you so much. I think we have one last question there from Gratitude, to just ask how traditional companies that don't believe in these systemic ways or open-minded to them, how do we engage them in conversation? Do you have a magical?
I think I would go back to the original mention of this conversation. It's building systems practitioners one conversation at a time. And I think for me, what I try to find in any organization that I go to is where is the fireplace of that organization? Where do people congregate? And where you find, or around what do they congregate? And when you discover the fireplace of that conversation, you then start to say, how do I work with what is already there to say, how do we ignite one conversation after another, building practitioners? So I think for me, the quick answer to that is, and rather simplistic answer, find the fireplace of that organization, find where people congregate, because those conversations are taking place. And it's just a question now of being able to get into that and building practitioners there.
Wow, that's such an amazing answer and approach, and beautiful energy for us to, to end today's presentation. Thank you so much, Sami, for sharing your fire with us. And I hope that we can keep the conversation going, and I'm sure it's not the last conversation that we'll have, but deep gratitude for sharing your fire and your deep wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rika. And thank you to all who joined in. And I'm really keen to journey with other people so that you can also encourage me as well on my journey as well. Thank you.
Great. Goodbye, everyone. We'll see each other in 2 weeks' time.